Chapter 7. The True Cost of Priceless. Battered and beaten both bodily and spiritually, Joey and Scally limped home from their grammar school alma mater. Although Joey was victorious in the ring, outside the ropes had been a colossal disaster. If the humiliation of getting 86'd by security wasn't bad enough, Father Randazzo had been waiting for his 2 resident gym teachers outside in the school parking lot. And after a frank discussion, St. Thomas Aquinas was now down one of their resident gym teachers. Scally, drowning his sorrows with a 40-ounce bottle of whatever battery acid he could legally or illegally carry inside a brown paper bag, made it crystal clear which of the 2 would be sleeping in late come Monday morning. "How do you let Father Randazzo fire me, and not quit gym teaching yourself?" Scally muttered, his lips as close to a pout as he could manage. It was as if he thought the bag concealing his 40 had become an appendage instead of the reason for so many of his woes. Joey looked over at his troubled and troubling friend. Fighting the urge to point out the obvious, he simply shifted the sports bag on his shoulder and explained, "Because you, not me, instigated that brawl with Morelli. Why do you have to get your ass kicked in the bleachers all the time?" Even if Scally's stock was down, way down, about as down as one stock could get, and it was, he was still not out. And him not being out meant that he could still be a Weisenheimer when properly called upon. "You get your ass kicked in the ring. It's the least I could do." Joey could only sigh because he had actually won tonight's fight after pulling off the impossible, lifting and slamming the massive wrestler ironically named Tiny. Working to keep the conversation as civil as possible, when he could have just as easily ripped his little friend's little head off, Joey said, "Well, this fiasco cost me my life insurance policy. I had to donate it to the league just to stay in it." Scally laughed as if that shouldn't have been a problem at all. "I was banned from your corner 3 years ago. Never stopped me from coming each week." It was as if Scally had no ability to comprehend the predicament he had put Joey in. "I'm in real danger now. All my opponents have a motive to kill me for real in the ring." With a dismissive shrug, Scally responded with the unhelpful, "Karma's a bitch." Thankfully, they had reached their destination. Home. Another quarter of a block, and Joey would have surely negotiated a pile driver between his idiot friend and the concrete. But as Joey and Scally climbed the stairs that led to the Casada apartment, that pile driver was suddenly looming once more. Scally reminded his much larger friend of this fact when he reached for the apartment's doorknob with one hand, while cradling the 40-ounce bottle of liquor with the other. Joey grabbed him. Whoa, where do you think you're going?" "What, you're evicting me now too?" Scally replied incredulously. Joey shot back, "You know the rule. No drinking inside the apartment." There was a look of horror in the lush's eyes as he looked down at his brown paper bag. "Joe, this is a 40. I don't care. You drink that out here or you throw it away." It was easily the hardest decision of Scally's not-so-short life. His gaze moved back and forth between the bottle and the door. On the one hand, he wanted to get inside and crash. On the other hand, it was, as he pointed out, a 40. In no mood to watch his drunken friend go through the long list of pros and cons, Joey shook his head and entered the apartment that his mother largely paid for. Well, more than largely. Completely would be the more appropriate adverb. Unconcerned with his contribution to the rent, though, he just shut the door. Scally was left behind like a wounded soldier on the battlefield. Only his wound came from shooting himself. A mere 30 seconds passed before Joey, out of the kindness of his heart or just pity, reopened the door. Scally, minus his 40 now, was completely blitzed and sprawled out on the floor. Joey kicked the bottom of his shoes. When that had no effect, he leaned over and in a low voice threatened to practice his latest wrestling moves on the nearly unconscious Scally. For a second, the Irish-American shot up, his fists ready to fight. A goofy smile quickly spread across his face as he saw who his opponent would be. Finally sick of the games, Joey hoisted Scally to his feet, pointed him in the right direction, and let go. Like a youngster learning how to ride a bike without training wheels for the first time, Scally stumbled through the door. Joey hissed, "Be careful, will you?" Slurring his words but still standing, somehow Scally countered, "I don't make the rules, I follow them." He tried to turn and look at Joey as if what he said was actually funny, but his arms flailed. He grabbed onto an expensive-looking glass dog statue for support. Quickly moving forward, Joey tried to stop his friend from using the objects around them as disposable props for his drunken antics. "Don't touch that! My mom bought it in Italy! It's priceless!" The words were lost on his best friend and manager, though, as Scally's eyes tried to take in what he was seeing. One of his fingers reached out and tapped the glass dog on the nose. "Since when are you allowed pets in here?" When it didn't move, Scally frowned at the pet, perhaps realizing that it wasn't alive, trying to cover for his drunkenness. He then straightened to look the inanimated object in the eyes. Big mistake. By straightening, he needed to push off the glass statue, which immediately led to it falling off its pedestal. Joey watched as if everything happened in slow motion. For a fraction of a second, it looked like the statue might not respond to gravity. But as Joey had found so many times in the ring, there was no way to defy the laws of Newton for long. The statue succumbed to the pull and made its inevitable way to the floor. It was only when the dog statue reached the floor that time seemed to resume at its usual pace. This came with the sound of the glass shattering into pieces. Joey blinked, and when his eyes opened, his mother's prized possession was unrecognizable. Instead of a dog, it looked more like the honky-tonk man's guitar after being shattered on top of the macho man's head. The call from the other room happened before Joey could fully digest what he had just witnessed. His mother's voice was even louder than the smashing of the glass. "Joey!" His mind cycling through a wealth of scenarios, Joey prepared to offer an explanation that wouldn't see Scally getting kicked out of the apartment. This was going to take some magic. If only he could delay the inevitable confrontation till the next day, the mandatory Sunday night dinner. Of course, the tension hung in the air all through the night, the next morning, and the next afternoon. Only Scally seemed immune to it, largely because he had little recollection of what had happened. As promised, both Joey and Scally were present for the mandatory Sunday dinner. Not that Joey had wished to miss it. He loved his mother's Sunday feasts, the spaghetti and meatballs, the sausage and manicotti. Forget about it! Whatever she made was perfectly delicious. And this time, she really outdid herself, a clear sign that she was not happy. When she was upset, Mrs. Quesada cooked. Since Scally had moved in, Joey had gotten accustomed to eating more than he had any right to. Yes, Joey and his mother were well aware of the high stakes at this possible Last Supper, but the source of the ill will was obliviously stuffing his face. Mrs. Quesada decided it was time for Scally to face the music. She would at least make him as miserable as he made her, clearing her throat to demand the scrawny devourer's attention. "New amendment to the rule, either you get yourself cleaned up entirely or you're out of this apartment." Even though he was looking at her when she said it, Scally seemed surprised. So much so he didn't bother to finish chewing and swallow his food. With his mouth full, he pointed his fork at himself. "Talking to me?" Grinding her teeth, Mrs. Quesada narrowed her eyes. "Do you have any idea how much that statue cost?" Scally looked to his friend as he pointed his fork at him, a bit of sauce dripping on the table. Joey said it was priceless. Her eyes on the sauce, Mrs. Quesada almost growled. "It was." "So then how did it cost anything?" "You get yourself in a program." Mrs. Quesada leaned forward. "I'm serious." She was just getting started. With her attention quickly shifting from one problem to another, she addressed her son. "As for you." Startled, Joey's eyes widened. "What as for me? I'm working for the school now. I'm here for Sunday dinner." Mrs. Quesada's finger immediately came out, and her son knew what that meant. She was going to broach the one subject that made him wince. Well, one of the subjects that made him wince. There were many such subjects. "When are you giving me a grandchild? I mean, are you even dating?" "I'm focused on the wrestling. Fame and fortune, and the ladies follow." Joey's response was clearly logical, to him anyway. "Ask me if I'm holding my breath," his mother retorted, shooting down such delusions of grandeur. Now Joey's eyes narrowed, but he knew better than to say anything else. Instead, he just glared. But the glare he was giving his mother was immediately undermined by the only non-Italian at the table. "Are you holding your breath, Mrs. C?" That's probably bad for digesting the man I got. Unaccustomed to anyone interrupting discussions of her son's future, Mrs. Quesada threw in the towel. In an attempt to mask her frustrations, she rose and headed over to wash her dish in the sink. With his mom thrown off by Scally's latest innocent albeit dumb remark, Joey quickly finished eating and dragged his friend out of the apartment before she regained her composure. Knowing that they had dodged a bullet, Joey kept Scally out until late that night. When he was certain his mom had gone to bed, he retired to his own with Scally. Yes, they really were sleeping in the same bed. With Scally fast asleep, snoring like a bear with laryngitis, Joey stared at the ceiling, contemplating his future. There was a lot to consider. First, He had to get Scally to take things seriously. It was only a matter of time before his mom would bring up her desire for grandchildren again. And of course, Joey's wrestling career was now on the ropes. But Scally was easily the most pressing problem. If he could get that straightened out, there wouldn't be anything to distract him from his goals. Rolling over, an image of Anne-Marie passed through his head. He mumbled something about her as he drifted off to sleep. Chapter 8. 10 or 15% of Anne-Marie. The next day, Joey took his best friend and worst enemy out for another walk. He couldn't exactly wrestle Scally into acting right, but it was time to buckle down and play his mom's role at least. As Scally took a swig from a hidden flask, Joey began to lecture him. "You better listen to my mom." Clearly offended, Scally held up the flask. "Look how small this is, at least I'm cutting back." "How many times you refill that today and it's not even noon?" "Semantics," Scally muttered. Feeling he had tried to be reasonable, Joey resorted to his preferred method of persuasion. He put his hands around his mouth and hollered, "Bush Club!" Before Scally could react, he was shoved, and hard. Unwilling to drop his flask and unable to grab onto anything with his free hand, he went tumbling into a row of well-manicured shrubs. Landing upside down, Scally blinked up at Joey, trying to figure out what just happened. Like a fish out of water, he began to squirm. "I'm stuck." Feeling guilty, but not really, Joey leaned over and lifted his friend out of the bushes. Scally, brushing his clothes and pulling twigs and leaves out of his hair, knew when it was time to change the subject. "So why didn't you bring up Anne-Marie Degrassi to your mom?" Muttering, Joey looked away. "I told you about that Rite Aid disaster. I heard she's back on the market. And she has a kid." This was news to Joey. "Really? We didn't get to the kid in our discussion." "Yeah, a little girl," Scally added. Joey considered his options as Scally continued to clean himself up. His friend's words were actually sinking in. "Wait, she's divorced?" Scally shook his head as he threw the last leaf back into the bushes. "She's a widow. Her husband died in a bizarre jump roping accident." This caused the one-day-a-week wrestler to take pause. Was this the world's first death by jump roping? Scally continued, "Some guy from out of town. He was exercising outside, tripped on the rope and hit his head on a curb or something. What an idiot." Deciding that this odd detail to this even odder event really didn't matter to his chances with Anne-Marie, Joey dismissed it. New hope was beginning to form in his mind. Their initial reunion hadn't been great. Far from it. He had obliterated a sales display of chocolate bars right in front of Anne-Marie's eyes. But this new bit of news changed everything. She was a young widow with a child. Joey felt certain that he would come off as the good guy, opening up his home and heart to her, and then she would remember just how much she loved him. Things were falling into place. Scally's words cut into his musings. "You could stop by the store again," with this one sentence. All of Joey's pleasantries suddenly came crashing down. "That's the last place I'm stopping by. Besides, Anne-Marie is still married in the eyes of our Lord." Of course. Why didn't he think of that sooner? This was the way he always talked himself out of positive steps forward in life. Quick to dismiss all that, Scally pressed forward. Well, when she reaches the Lord, she can rekindle her marriage. In the meantime, she's a package deal with the daughter. Your mom's grandchild problem solved. There was a real simplicity to that logic, Joey had to admit. As he reflected on this with a smile, Anne-Marie Degrassi. Remember our 7th grade field trip, how much she was into me? An equally happy expression passed over Scally's face as he thought about that particular memory. How could I forget? This quickly brought Joey back into the present and his eyes narrowed. His feelings about that day were just as fresh after 3 decades. And they weren't all good. Yeah, how could you? That one day back in 7th grade had started off so promising. Their class had gone on a field trip to a dude ranch, and Joey had been one of the most popular students. Still dwarfing all the other students in both size and strength, he looked around the barn where they were ending their day's activities. The animals in their pens were hardly the focus of the kids at that moment, though. The sound of one of the boys letting out a battle cry was music to Joey's ears. All of the adults were now out of sight. Turning to his classmates, Joey was ready to put on a show, especially for the girls standing off to the side. The boys reached him one at a time, making it all too easy to take them down with a wide range of devastating wrestling moves. Scally stood rooting for his pal amongst the girls, who all giggled over the impressive athletic display. He turned to look at Anne-Marie. and the adoring expression on her face as she watched the heroics. As Scally's eyes shifted back to Joey, he began to think about the women who would be interested in the manager of a famous wrestler someday. "Boys, enough!" A young woman came storming into the barn with a glare on her face. Her presence was more than enough to stop the boys from their antics, mostly because of how attractive she was. They were all putty in Miss Whalen's hands when it came right down to it. The only one to ignore her was Joey, who was much more interested in his next opponent than his teacher. Finishing a final suplex on the closest boy, he finally looked up, a huge grin on his face. The exasperated expression on Miss Whalen's face caused the smile on his to finally falter. "Joey, please, before you kill someone." Scally strolled over to his pal, quick in his attempt to deflect her concerns. "It's okay, Miss W. All the parents signed waivers." The wry look she gave him let Scally know that she was about to burst his bubble. They signed permission slips, and permission to fight was not granted. Sensing an opportunity to show off his managerial skills, Scally pressed on. "Well, I organized all this." He gave her the most charming look he could muster. In reality, Scally looked rather sleazy for a 7th grader. "Maybe you should keep me after school." Her face was deadpan as she responded, "We aren't at school today. You could take me into the barn and scold me." "Get on the bus, Robert." No longer interested in his foolishness, the teacher looked around at the rest of the class, "And that goes for everyone. It's time to head home." A collective groan sounded as if she were trying to herd farm animals out of the barn. The students then grumbled amongst themselves as they began to head toward the bus. Seeing a unique opportunity, Joey worked his way toward the prettiest girl in class. Anne-Marie could see him working his way toward her, so she made sure to hang back away from her girlfriends. The grin on his face hid Joey's uncertainty. His heart beating fast, he tried to exude confidence in her. "So what did you think?" He needn't have worried, though, as Anne-Marie turned her large eyes toward him. There was nothing but admiration in her voice as she said, "That was amazing." Hearing that, Joey decided to really lay it on thick. Looking around the barn, he said, "Yeah, I took it easy on him. I save my most vicious moves for adults." Giving him a shy look, Anne-Marie still wanted to keep Joey's attention. She knew how quickly he could get distracted by the other girls, who were just as eager to talk to him after he wrestled as she was. Remembering she had something to share, she quickly pulled her book bag around and took out a pack of pink snowball cakes her mother had packed for her that morning. She thrust one of them toward Joey. His mouth salivated at the sight of the marshmallowy treat, and he reached for it. When his fingers brushed the palm of her hand during the transfer, Anne-Marie began to blush. Trying to distract herself from her thoughts, she asked, "Aren't these delicious?" Joey had just taken a bite, but he wanted to respond in a way that was cool. Shoving the cake to the side of his mouth, he smiled at her. "Well, I am vicious and—" His eyes went wide and he looked at her again. "Wait a minute. Say that again." Confused, she looked down at her snowball. "Delicious?" "Vicious and delicious." He looked delighted. "Yeah, I like the sound of that." Clueless to what Joey was going on about, Anne-Marie wanted to keep his focus on her. "Can I sit next to you on the bus?" The suddenness of the question brought Joey back to the present. As interested as he was in her, Joey didn't want her to get the wrong idea. "Listen, Anne-Marie, no disrespect or anything, but I'm not looking to settle down till I'm champ." Her shoulders slumped as she looked at her partially eaten dessert. Feeling a bit guilty, he offered her a fair consolation. "But I'm cool with making out on the ride home." Her eyes lit up. "Okay." They boarded the bus together and moved toward the back. One look from Joey and the two boys occupying the last seat quickly got up and moved to another part of the bus. Anne-Marie bounced as she sat, her excitement getting the better of her. Joey sat down beside her, his voice lower than usual as he began to flirt. As it got darker outside, Joey removed his jacket. Holding it up, he leaned over to kiss Anne-Marie. Her lips were puckered up, and she sat stiffly as he got close. Laughing, he gave her a quick peck on the lips. Moments later, Joey had warmed up, and the kisses started to get more intense. He peeked out to make sure they weren't in danger of getting caught, and was pleased to see Miss Whalen talking animatedly with the bus driver up front. Chuckling to himself, he turned his attention back to Anne-Marie. He felt a twinge of pity for Scally because Whalen clearly had a thing for the driver, but that quickly left his mind. Making out with his girl of the moment, Joey was certain there would be no more interruptions. As things got hot and heavy, at least in 7th grade terms, Anne-Marie pulled away slightly and giggled. "Joey, stop!" Joey moved closer and pulled her to him. Giving her another deep kiss, he finally responded, What? You don't like my technique? She looked at him shyly. No, the kissing is fine. It's your hands. Confused, Joey looked at her. I'm not using my hands. Her expression shifted, and Anne-Marie looked annoyed. I'm not kidding. Realizing there was something more sinister at play, Joey removed his jacket that was acting as a blanket for them. Smiling up at him was Scally, his scrawny right hand hidden up Anne-Marie's shirt. Swinging at Scally, Joey yelled, "Scally, you idiot!" Moving out of reach, Scally held up his hands. "Lish, I'm your manager. I get 15%. Joey responded angrily, 10%. That's an agent. And an ass-kicking. Joey wasn't about to let someone weasel in on his girl. Scally had gone too far, and he was going to teach him a lesson about what he was willing to share a signed contract or not. Amazingly, neither Miss Whalen nor the bus driver noticed or cared as Joey began to throw his best friend around the back of the bus like a rag doll. The other kids cheered at the impromptu entertainment. Remembering that day still upset Joey, and he hovered over his now adult friend back in the present. Without a word, he shoved Scally back into the shrubs and walked away. Again, Scally blinked at the sudden change in perspective, his body hanging upside down with his head just a couple of inches off the ground. Once he realized what had happened, he called out with desperation. "Come on, Lish, that's ancient history. You're still carrying that around?" But Joey would not be lending a helpful hand this time. Scally wiggled frantically. "I'm really stuck this time. Help." Chapter 9. The Golden God and Asian Beauties. Scally looked up at the ominous building and sighed. He really didn't want to be there, and he definitely didn't want to look like one of those suckers who were easily defeated by others. He was quite content with easily defeating himself. He was only there because his best friend's mom was threatening to kick him out of the apartment. As much as he wanted to continue living his life as poorly as he always had, Scally knew that he had to at least make an effort. With another sign, he entered the building's facility and approached the receptionist. She looked to be about the same age as Mrs. Casada. Her blue eyes were arrestingly beautiful once, but now they were just arresting. Her stern glare left Scally feeling sheepish. "May I help you?" Her tone was more of a demand than a question. Trying to steady himself, Scally managed to say, "Yes, I have a problem." The receptionist gave him a forced smile. "Then you've come to the right place." She was clearly waiting for Scally to rattle off more specifics, but he wasn't ready to elaborate just yet. The sound of the entrance door opening behind him caught Scally's attention, and he turned to see two attractive Asian women enter the facility. They didn't stop by the receptionist. Instead, they continued to walk straight to the back, turning only when they reached the room at the end of the hall. Almost as if being woken from a trance, Scally was called back to his own situation by the receptionist. Substance abuse, alcoholism, or sex addiction? Scally thought for a moment, then his eyes went back to the end of the hall where the Asian women had been just seconds ago. Flopping down on the curb, Joey shoved a greasy slice from the neighborhood's finest pizzeria, Lenny and John's, into his mouth. As Sauce threatened to make a run for his Adidas tracksuit, he decided to put up a firewall. He tucked a napkin in the front of his jacket and smiled at the memories that it inspired. This particular Adidas tracksuit had been Joey's favorite for several decades. And it showed. A group of kids took notice as they dribbled a basketball past the curbside Brooklyn feast. "Hey, Grandpa, nice Adidas look. Is that from the 90s? One quipped. This quip was met with mocking laughter from the others. Pulling what was left of his nearly devoured slice from his mouth, Joey responded, "Smart ass. As a matter of fact, it's from '88. I bought it special for WrestleMania 4. Another kid spoke up, "God, did they even have TVs then?" Joey ignored the laughter as he stood up. "I didn't watch it on TV. I was there." Wanting to show off his own brand of humor, yet another kid put his hands on the side of his face. Looking with mock surprise at his buddies, he said, "He was there." The kid with the basketball gave Joey a look. "He should frame those pants." Grabbing the ball, one of the other kids said, "Yeah, what a loser." He then took off as the rest of the group laughed and followed. Looking down at his tracksuit, Joey mumbled, "Damn, can't even rock the Adidas anymore." He plopped back down on the curb feeling defeated. Suddenly, a great bright light shined upon him, and Joey turned to see a majestic figure standing where the annoying kids had just been. The man's hair was more like a rich, golden mane, and his skin glowed like he was a Greek god. Unlike Joey, this man also wore a $10,000 suit. His eyes moved over the struggling wrestler, as if to size the mere mortal up. He then said,
Joseph Michael Casata, also known as Joeylicious.
Feeling like this was a dream, Joey squinted at the figure's glow. Eventually, he shielded his eyes and responded, God? His question was met with the proclamation.
It's time you were taught how to style and profile.
As his eyes adjusted to the sun behind the man, Joey finally saw who was addressing him. His jaw dropped. The Nature Boy, Ric Flair, even better. Joey got on his knees and bowed to the 16-time world heavyweight champion.
Get up, Licious. Someone might get the wrong idea.
Suddenly full of energy, Joey sprung up to his feet. Ric Flair continued,
Let's go to work.
Excitement coursed through Joey's entire being as he followed one of his mentors with glee. You're going to train me to be the fifth horseman?
No, I'm taking you for new threads. You want to be the man, you got to dress like the man. Woo!
Wow, that sounds sick. But I just bounced a check getting my highlights done. I'm cleaned out till next month. Rick waved a hand.
Don't worry, Lish. It's all on the Nature Boy.
Feeling proud of his first step, Scally found himself baring his soul to a room full of sex addicts while he ate a chocolate donut. It didn't matter that Scally had only had sex once so far in his not-so-short life. This was progress. Although, did he actually have sex with Lisa Abramowitz that fateful autumn night in the 11th grade at Richie Guilio's house party? He was hammered as usual and couldn't remember a damn thing. Lisa couldn't remember much either. After the supposed deed was done in the laundry room, she pretended to not even know who Scally was. They had 4 classes together that year, so this last detail was a bit suspect. Nonetheless, Scally was currently bearing, and the 2 Asian women that he followed in were eating it up. I don't know what it is. I just can't stop having sex. I mean, over and over, day after day, night after night, I'm like a machine. And as soon as I'm done, I can start right up again. Out of the corner of his eye, the little schemer noticed the 2 women sharing a look before leaning forward. They were clearly hooked. Now all Scally needed to do was reel them in. Some lab should study me. I bet they'd come up with a formula for a new super Viagra. The 2 women swooned, barely able to contain themselves. Meanwhile, Scally could barely contain his smile. He had a thing for Asian women ever since he saw that hottie co-star with Christian Slater in the 1989 cult classic, Gleaming the Cube, and now he actually had a chance to get his own cube gleamed twice. The sex addiction counselor cleared his throat. His expression was the exact opposite of Scally's. All right, Scally, thank you for sharing that. Again, beaming, Scally replied, Anytime. I'm here to start the healin'. His gaze shifted to the 2 women. Maybe even spread it around if I can. This got a giggle out of the ladies. Well, I'll see some of you again tomorrow. Others. The counselor looked directly at Scally. Feel free to take the rest of the week off. As the sex addiction session began to disperse, Scally stopped by the refreshment table for another donut or 3. He wanted to take a little something with him, but he also wanted to give the 2 Asian beauties a chance to approach him. Like moths drawn to a flame, they did just that. The taller one spoke first. Hi, Scally. Pretending to be surprised, Scally looked up from his donuts. Oh, hey, it's Washi, isn't it? She nodded, then motioned to her friend. And this is Sayo. Are you still up for spreading that healing? One of the donuts was halfway to Scally's mouth when he heard Washi's words. The donut stayed halfway to his mouth. Sayo seemed a bit more nervous than her aggressive playmate. Softly touching Scally's puny arm, she suggested while looking down, We can go to your place. Scally put the donuts down, all of them. Is every meeting like this? Washi looked at her friend with uncertainty before turning back to Scally. Is there a problem? His head began to shake vigorously. No, what time is it? Washi looked over to the clock on the wall. Almost 3. Scally's mind frantically went through the schedules of Joey and his mom before realizing that he couldn't possibly have planned this more perfectly. He immediately said so. Perfect. My roommate should be out training. The mere mention of someone else possibly joining the party excited Sayo even more. Roommate? Her friend was just as interested. Training? With memories of what had happened didn't happen with all of his other potential female scores over the decades, Scally made it abundantly clear that he was not offering Joey. He clarified, he's definitely not home. Trying to erase the thought of another man cramping his style, especially Joey, He then motioned for the ladies to follow him. Come on. Chapter 10. The Fifth Horseman. Ric Flair led Joey to the front of a high-end clothing store that Joey would never have approached on his own. Holding his arms out, Rick announced,
"Here we are! Woo!"
Shaking his head, Joey did not feel comfortable. "But Nate, I don't wear dress suits. I'm more of a tracksuit kind of guy." To emphasize this, he pointed to the attire that the kids had just ridiculed him for attiring in. His mentor just gave him a knowing look.
"Trust me on this, Lish."
Rick opened the door and ushered Joey inside. They were barely in the door when a snobby, bald-headed salesman was upon them. It must have been a slow day. Things were about to pick up. The salesman's smile was clearly forced as he asked, "May I help you?" Joey watched as Rick spoke up.
"My prodigy will take 2 of your most expensive suits."
"Great. And when will your prodigy be arriving?" Rick frowned and nodded toward Joey.
"He's standing right next to me, Daddy!"
Bursting with pride, Joey puffed out his chest. The salesman quickly deflated such feelings. "Oh, I thought he was from the moving company." Joey's forehead wrinkled. "You guys are moving?" "No, you just looked the part."
"And that's why we're here."
"Okay then. Our most expensive suits go for about $7,500. The salesman was happy to get this so-called prodigy dressed and out the door before any of the store's more worldly patrons showed up.
"That's a little on the low end, but it'll have to do."
Joey reached out to stop Rick as he moved forward. "Wait! 7 times, that's about." His eyes seemed like they would roll back in his head as he did the math. "That's almost 10 grand.
"Nice try. Good thing for you, I have more money than Jesus."
This discombobulated Joey even more. He never thought of Jesus in terms of money. "JC had bank? I thought the Sermon on the Mount was on the arm." Rick looked at Joey incredulously. Feeling a little foolish, Joey tried to explain, "You know the loaves and the fishes. He actually paid for all that?" Rick, as if this pointless conversation about sermons and fishes was beneath him, just turned back to the salesman.
"Bring him 1 in tan and 1 in black."
The salesman nodded and went to work, returning with a tan suit first. Joey was ushered into the fitting room, where he tried on a pair of pants. When he stepped out, he was given a shirt and tie. Finally, after the salesman put the tan jacket over Joey's inexperienced shoulders, the transformation was complete. The Italian dream couldn't believe his eyes. He hadn't looked this good since Uncle Benny's funeral. Benny wasn't really Joey's uncle. He was just a guy from the neighborhood who everyone called Uncle Benny. In actuality, Benny was never anyone's uncle. He was an only child. Poor Benny. But lucky Joey. Behind him, Rick let out his trademark shout.
"Woo! Now we're talking! You could be one of the horsemen dressed like that!"
"Wow, really? You'll saddle me up?" Joey could almost faint.
"Perhaps. But it's not just about the look. You also have to walk the walk."
Joey posed in front of a full-length mirror as he considered this business of walking the walk. To encourage him, Rick called out,
"Try it, Lish."
Like this? A little off balance at first, Joey attempted the famous Flair strut. It was not a pretty sight, and he completely lost his confidence seeing how it looked in the mirror.
"You look like a one-legged duck in heat. Here, try this on for size."
Rick was about to unleash the nature boy. He grabbed a suit jacket off the rack and threw it on the floor. An elbow drop to the sleeve quickly followed, and as the 16-time world champ continued to beat on the jacket, Rick repeated over and over again at the top of his lungs, "Woo! Woo!" Wanting nothing less than to emulate his hero, Joey grabbed another jacket off the rack and followed Rick's example. In between elbow drops of his own, he continued to practice the duck strut as he screamed "woo" throughout the store. Frantic but too afraid to put his body on the line, the salesman called out, "No, please, you're destroying them." Seeing no way to stop the carnage, he rushed away to call for help. Rick and Joey continued their wrestling moves against the helpless suits, throwing them all over the floor and dropping elbows and knees. Successful attempts were followed by strutting and frequent woos. The destruction continued unabated for some time, until the salesman returned with the police behind him. Pointing at Joey, he cried, "Arrest this lunatic!" Joey only became aware of his new surroundings when the cops grabbed him and slapped the cuffs on. Stunned, Joey looked at the cuffs and then frantically scanned the store for Rick. Wait, what are you doing? Nature's gonna pay for everything. The cops looked around for Joey's accomplice, but Ric Flair was nowhere to be found. In fact, the nature boy was never actually there. It was becoming more and more apparent, or just plain apparent, that Joey had much bigger issues to deal with other than his under 500 wrestling record. He was knucking futs. As if to put their minds at ease about the so-called accomplice, the salesman said to the cops, "He's been talking to himself since he came in. He wanted only to keep the Italian menace from disrupting future business. Take him away, he's frightening the customers." His voice more of a wail than a demand as the other patrons continued to crouch behind clothing racks, in an effort to defend themselves from the flying carnage. Pointing at Joey, the salesman continued, "And yes, I am pressing charges for the damages." Shaking his head, Joey had one final plea, "Hold on, I'll write you a check." He began to struggle as the cops hauled him toward the door. Desperate for help, Joey looked around for his mentor. "Rick, Nate, where are you? I'm still going to be a horseman, right?" Chapter 11. Rapid-Firing Sex Machine. Scally ushered Washi and Sayo into Joey's room. He nearly bumped into them as they looked around in awe. They were either intrigued or horrified. With all the wrestling posters, wrestling dolls, and fake championship belts hanging about, it was as if they had been lured into the den of a child or a serial killer. Or both. Washi frowned. "What's all this?" Quick to dismiss what he was quite used to, Scally responded, "My roommate's a collector." Looking at him with suspicion, Washi pressed, "You share a bedroom? Of course, we're roommates." Sayo picked up a Jimmy Superfly snooker doll. Unlike Washi, the charm of the paraphernalia suddenly grew on her. "Oh, how cute." Wanting to make the most of her more accepting feelings, Scally approached. "That's a specialty item." Still not impressed with the decor, Washi decided to get down to business. Enough with the chatter. She strode over to Scally. Grinning, Sayo agreed, "It's about time we saw your specialty." Things had never gone this smoothly for Scally in this department, and he was dead sober. He didn't have a clue on how to proceed. Gulping, he looked between the two beauties as they came at him from both sides. Mrs. Casada entered the apartment with groceries and placed them on the kitchen counter. Peculiar sounds caught her attention. Realizing that they were coming from her son's bedroom, she called out, "Joey, you're home?" There was no answer. Certain that she had heard something, Mrs. Casada skipped putting away the groceries and headed straight for the room. She was halfway there when she remembered that another problem man-child lived with her rent-free. Suddenly, the noises that were getting louder now made more sense. "Oh." Her voice was more disappointed than relieved. She almost wished it had been a burglar instead of Scally. Still, she'd given the bombastic blonde one last chance, figuring she may as well see how that went. Mrs. Casada opened the door. "Robert, how was your meat?" It was as if the rest of her sentence had been stabbed in the back as her eyes took in the unfathomable scene before her. Scally, Washi, and Sayo were crammed into one bed fighting for space under Joey's Italian dream sheets. It was clear nothing had happened yet. The look of sexual frustration on the ladies' faces said it all. Mrs. Casada's shock quickly turned to rage as she found her voice. "What the hell is this?" Scally froze and looked up equally shocked. "Mrs. C, you're early." Sayo took in the presence of Mrs. Casada before turning back to Scally. "She's your mom?" Washi shook her head. He called her Mrs. "My roommate's mom," Scally clarified. Mrs. Casada was the woman he should have clarified things with. She was just getting started. "This is what goes on when I'm not around?" Scally realized his mistake. Nothing went on yet. Of course his reassurance was short-lived. "But if you give me 5 minutes..." Washi was more taken aback by this admission than from Mrs. Casada's intrusion. 5 minutes? You said you were a machine." Trying to placate the angry Asian, Scally casually responded, "Yeah, a rapid-firing machine." Mrs. Casada nearly screamed, "I'll give you 5 minutes!" There was no other warning as the fleet-footed 65-year-old charged into the fray. Washi and Sayo, despite being in their underwear, leapt from the oncoming fury and scampered away from the bed. Abandoned by his, could-have-been but never was as usual playmates, Scally hid under the sheets. With no lethal weapons available, Mrs. Casada grabbed the nearest pillow and began pummeling her idiot son's idiot friend. Scally pleaded hopelessly, "Take it easy. I just started my healin'." Taking their cue from Mrs. Casada, Washi and Sayo grabbed pillows of their own and joined in on the beatdown. With nowhere to go and nothing to do, Scally just curled up into a ball and prayed for a quick death. A few hours later, in the lobby of a police station, Scally sat slumped and defeated on a hard plastic chair. The bruises on his face and his messy hair made it clear that his beating did not end quickly. But he wasn't at the police station for his own indiscretions this time. His partner in crime had also been up to no good. And this is what really threw Scally for a loop. In the past, he was always the one responsible for Joey's arrests. Like when they stole the statue of St. Peter from one church and brought it to the garden of St. Paul's Church. That was his idea, not Joey's. All Scally wanted to do was to show a biblical example of robbing Peter to pay Paul. But the churches and cops didn't respond well to the lesson. Mrs. Quesada emerged from the interrogation room with Joey in tow. Joey was carrying the roughed-up tan and black suits from the store. Seeing a bit of sunlight, Scally gleamed. "Lish, you made bail?" Mrs. Quesada glared at her other useless mouth to feed. "We made an arrangement." Looking his friend over, Scally asked, "What's with the suits?" "I bought 'em on layaway, that's the arrangement." After answering the question, Joey finally took notice of his disheveled friend. "What happened to you?" Before Scally could respond, Mrs. Quesada stopped the conversation cold. "Don't get me started on him." Scally was beside himself. "You already got started." Turning to his best friend, he pointed at the true culprit of his current misery. "Lish, she burned your Italian dream sheets." "What? Why?" Mrs. Quesada couldn't believe that she actually had to explain herself. "They were soiled in sin." Feeling betrayed, Joey cried. "That was my last set." He immediately directed his anger at the person whom he knew was truly at fault. "Scally, what the heck did you do?" "Me? Not about to stand around listening to whining." Mrs. Quesada issued an order. "Let's go. Both of you. This isn't the place to advertise family business." Leaving them no room to argue, she grabbed both of them by their shirt collars and dragged them toward the exit. "And you're both confessing to Father Randazzo this week." Chapter 12. Three's a confessional crowd. It was closing time at Rite Aid, and Joey hid off to the side just outside the store. He held a bouquet of flowers and wore his tan suit, which had a rather significant tear that ran down the back of the jacket. A bundle of nerves, he continuously adjusted his compromised suit as he waited impatiently. Joey had really upset his mother this time, so he was going to do whatever he could to make it up to her. In the process, he hoped to find a little happiness of his own. The lights in the Rite Aid shut off, and Anne-Marie soon exited. The instant she turned away to lock up, Joey popped up behind her. "Anne-Marie!" She jumped and dropped the keys at the unexpected and somewhat frightening call. Quickly spinning back, she spatted, "Jesus, Joey, you scared me!" Looking apologetic, Joey retreated a step. "Oh, I'm sorry. Are you closing up? I just came to buy a vase for these flowers." He held up the bouquet. Anne-Marie looked at them, puzzled at first. We don't sell vases." Joey handed her the flowers. Anne-Marie finally got the message. Touched, she said, "Thank you. They're beautiful." She finished locking up. "But I have to get home now, so..." Not willing to let her escape so soon, Joey asked with a touch of desperation in his voice, "Do you like my suit?" "I just came from a big match. Had to deal with the press." Anne-Marie looked at her old flame more closely. The flashy suit didn't fit the impression she was left with from their last encounter. Dressed like that, you must be a success. Then again, she couldn't see the tear in the jacket from where she was standing. Joey beamed. "Yeah, I'm doing well. As a matter of fact, I have another match tomorrow night. You should come." Hesitantly, Anne-Marie asked, "Where at?" "Good Shepherd." This seemed to confirm her suspicions. The church? The gym next to the church. Joey realized that he just stepped in it. Quickly trying to recover, he further clarified, "I like to give back to the neighborhood when I can." Not entirely convinced, she again looked him up and down. "Oh, well, that's good of you. So you'll come?" "I'm not sure. I have a little girl now. It's tough to find a babysitter on such short..." Suddenly, Anne-Marie couldn't complete the sentence. With her voice caught in her throat, she placed a hand over her mouth. She was upset. Joey moved closer. "What's wrong? We had a tragedy recently. My husband..." Already knowing where this was going, Joey supplied the rest of the story. "He died?" Trying to comfort Anne-Marie, he reached out and hugged her. Anne-Marie was clearly not expecting this response, and she stood there stiffly as Joey patted her back. "That's terrible, and for it to happen so suddenly..." Joey continued with his comforting. But Anne-Marie was no dummy. She could feel Joey's forced sincerity with every forced pat. Pushing him away, she said, "How did you know it was sudden?" Now Joey had really stepped in it, and he immediately tried to backpedal. "You know, The accident. It must have been a shock. Anne-Marie narrowed her eyes. You knew this whole time, didn't you? Even when you came by last week. This was definitely not the same girl who shared her snowballs with Joey, but he still tried to play dumb. What do you mean? Is that what this is? You see an opening 30 years later and just show up as a shoulder to cry on? No. Joey frantically searched for a proper explanation. The search did not end well. Anne-Marie brushed past him. I should get going. Joey desperately pulled out his last card to play. Anne-Marie, wait! I'm ready to settle down! She didn't even slow down. As impossible as it was to believe, the second reunion between Joey and Anne-Marie outside Rite Aid was even worse than their first reunion inside. Father Randazzo sat in the confessional booth adjusting his robes as he waited for the next sinner. It had already been a long session, and the good priest was dying to get out of there. TV Land's Murder, She Wrote marathon was about to begin, and by God, he was not going to miss a single rerun. Praying that his next confessor would be his last, he looked up as someone's hand pulled the screen shut from the other side of the booth. This would be a secret confession. At least that's what it was intended to be. Father Randazzo knew the voice as soon as Joey opened his mouth. Bless us, Father, for we have sinned. The priest had been ready to respond to Joey, but one of those words struck him as odd, to say the least. Us? Scally's voice was unmistakable. Yeah, there's two of us. He didn't need the verification, but the priest couldn't help but ask, Robert, is that you? Scally began to hiss at Joey. I thought he couldn't see us. Joey's voice was harsh, and the priest thought he heard someone get smacked in the head. He can't! Of course that was Scally's head. Trying his best to remain calm, Father Randazzo was now afraid to ask, Joseph, what are you two up to? Murder, She Wrote was definitely going to have to wait. Well, it's like this, Father. You're our priest, but you're also our employer. Your employer, Scally corrected. Right, he fired your ass. Father Randazzo quickly cut off that kind of talk. Joseph, please. Then, quite surprisingly, the priest heard uncertainty in his young, still employed gym teacher's voice. Whatever I say in here can't be used against me at work, right? You know, like attorney-client privilege. So that means he can use things against me? Why am I even here? Scally's input was as asinine as the priest could have expected. Struggling with his role as usual with these two, Father Randazzo asked as much as stated, Why do I have a feeling both of you will be reciting the entire rosary after this? There's no time for that, Father. Joey was quick to prevent the priest from administrating his usual penance following a confession. We're on our way to a match. Hoping to get this over with for Angela Lansbury's sake at least, the priest sighed. Go ahead. Unfortunately, those two tiny, and on the surface, harmless words opened up a floodgate of sins that Father Randazzo had no chance of stemming. He couldn't differentiate between Joey's transgressions and Scally's, but he could guess. Unable to control himself any longer, the priest cried out, One at a time! Jesus! There was a moment of silence from the other side of the booth before Joey reprimanded his own priest. Now, Father, Joey eventually said in the midst of reprimanding his own priest. We wouldn't want someone else to have to confess while we're in here. Chapter 13. Bingo and Brawl. There it was in not-so-bright letters on the not-so-impressive marquee just outside the gymnasium of Good Shepherd's Elementary School. Joey, wearing his new black suit, minus the sleeves, stood with Una Grenada and Milkshake as they glared up at the unflattering placement of their precious, albeit unflattering wrestling league. It was Saturday night, and the boys should have been raring to go in their pre-fight attire. But alas, on this Saturday night, they were not. Joey was the first to voice his displeasure. Why are we second banana? Even though Una Grenada was equally displeased, he decided to play devil's advocate for the sake of bingo. I think it's alphabetical. B-I-B-R. Joey shook his head, unwilling to accept this logic. We have a dot after our B. Looking uncertain, Milkshake asked, Do dots come before I's? Of course they do, Joey shot back. Appearing less caring by the second, Una Grenada simply responded, We'll have to get a judge's ruling on that. From a distance, an all too familiar voice called out, The clock on the wall says it's time to brawl. Scally materialized with a styrofoam cup of beer firmly in hand. Joey could tell he was drunk already, and it wasn't even 8 o'clock yet. Okay, it was 5 after. Milkshake looked about as annoyed as Joey felt. Here comes your honor now. Scally was the lanky wrestler's arch nemesis outside the ring. Boy, would he love to get him inside. Joey folded his arms at his so-called manager. Where the heck did you go? Stopped by McFadden's. My credits. Still good there. It was common knowledge that Scally had open tabs in every bar in the Brooklyn diocese. Apparently, McFadden's hadn't done their homework. You just told Father Randazzo that you started AA. Joey couldn't believe the gall. Well, he could believe it, but still. Can a man celebrate his sobriety? Scally adjourned the argument and then downed the rest of his beer, tossing his empty cup aside with no trash can in sight. Una Granada and Milkshake just headed toward the gymnasium. Joey shook his head and did the same. The setup inside the brawl venue was even more disappointing than the marquee. There was no ring, and not a single wrestling material was to be found. Instead, there was just a bunch of senior citizens playing bingo. Still. And a rough-looking bunch of old-timers at that, missing teeth, eye patches, even a few wooden legs. They looked like an elderly biker gang, minus the leather jackets and bikes. Joey and the boys looked around, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. It was bad enough that bingo had top billing over them, but they should have wrapped up their last game some time ago. Scally burst through the wrestlers and saw what made them stop dead in their tracks. I know I'm lit, but did we step into another dimension? Joey frowned. They're supposed to be done and gone by 7:30. Una Granada pulled out his cell and glanced at the time. It's after 8. Milkshake added, and Tiny fights you in 10 minutes. Joey held out his hands in utter frustration. They don't even have the ring set up. Una Granada noticed what the others didn't. Pointing across the facility, he said, well, it looks like Lou's on it. Sure enough, Lou Rosati was having a heated discussion with the Monsignor of Good Shepherd. And the Monsignor, also a senior, looked like a tough hombre in his own right. Making the best of a bad situation, Scally headed to a bingo table. I'm getting in on this, mother. There's money on the line. Joey ignored his manager's quick abandonment and continued to complain. This is ridiculous. I busted out my new look and everything. Una Granada took a good gander at the Italian dream. Yeah, that jacket's pretty badass. It came like that without the sleeves? Not exactly. Joey answered with some embarrassment as he briefly reflected on the suit store fiasco. Lou, finally spotting his wrestlers, headed their way. He was clearly just as pissed about what was going on. Come on, let's go. We're canceled here tonight. Damn, man. Milkshake slumped and looked around. He had hoped that they would salvage the evening somehow. Joey wasn't willing to give up so easily. What do you mean we're canceled? We're the main event. Lou patted Joey on the arm in an effort to comfort the veteran wrestler. We didn't sell enough tickets, and bingo's running late, so we can start later. I haven't missed a Saturday night match in 20 years. Joey wasn't kidding. He really hadn't. He even broke his arm once during a bizarre cannoli eating incident. That occurred on a Saturday afternoon at the Feast of San Gennaro, and Joey still wrestled that night, albeit in excruciating pain. Sorry, kid. But even Garrick Street came to an end. Lou had seen it all. This was just another miserable night in his mostly miserable existence. One of the senior women turned and glared at the intrusion of wrestlers. Smacking her gums together, she spatted, "Keep it down back there! I can't hear the numbers." Mockingly holding up his hands, Milkshake tried to placate the old battle axe in an undiplomatic way. Take it easy, Grandma. Maybe turn up your listening device. Her eyes glowed red now. Screw you, you non-white person. Realizing he was also a non-white person, Una Granada coughed up. Oh, snap! One of the senior men sitting next to the battle axe turned to voice his opinion of the brawl crew. He looked like a typical retired wise guy straight from Martin Scorsese's Central Casting. Check out the getup on these guys. Looks like the village people are back in town. This caused the rest of the seniors to join in on the verbal abuse party. Someone from the back table called out, "Where's the cop and the chief?" This got a round of uproarious laughs, and the wrestlers were reaching their breaking point. Popping his knuckles, Milkshake muttered, "I'm about to whoop some senior citizen ass." Una Granada seconded the motion. Sign me up. Suddenly, Scally leapt up from the table he had planted himself at. Bingo! The hag next to the drunken imposter stood up shakily. That's my card! She reached out trying to snatch it. Scally quickly moved the card to his other hand and held it high. Finders keepers, losers weepers. An old man with an eye patch stood up and grabbed the bingo menace. Trying to pull the card from Scally's dancing hand, he shouted, "Give it back to her!" Seeing that Scally had again, and as usual, required parental intervention, Joey addressed the other two wrestlers. I better get in there. Scally screamed and gyrated as he desperately tried to keep his bingo winner from the growing number of wrinkled and veiny hands working just as desperately to snag it. Paws off. She can collect on the next round. Joey stepped into the fray, hoping to resolve things more peacefully. Seniors were a reasonable age demographic after all. Scal, knock it off! He tried to grab the bingo card as well. Suddenly, the focus of the senior citizen's rage turned on Joey. The one with the eye patch asked incredulously, "Who are you now?" From somewhere else in the vicinity, a sweet old lady with a pink sweater hollered, "Nice jacket, Ginzo." Taking umbrage, Joey's eyes darted around in search of the self-proclaimed fashion critic. Who said that? Several of the more ruthless bingo players began to surround even Una Grenada and Milkshake. Up until that point, the two wrestlers of color had stayed on the sidelines. But the Italian Dream knew that would not last. Waving at his brawl companions, Joey called out, "Guys, get out of there, it's not worth it." Suddenly, a single and familiar godlike voice rose above the clamor.
Woo!
Joey looked to the distance and saw Ric Flair mauling a group of seniors on the other side of the gym. Unable to believe his eyes at first, he called out, "The Nature Boy!" Before the blonde Adonis was able to respond to his biggest fan, Rick was overrun by another gaggle of bloodthirsty old-timers. It was time for Joeylicious to rescue his hero. "Don't worry, Nate, the fifth horseman rides." As Joeylicious charged forward, an all-out brawl erupted. The wrestlers were severely outnumbered, but they had middle age on their side. Lou even got into the swing of things as he squared off against the Monsignor. Tables and chairs were turned over, bingo cards flew through the air, and Scally's screams echoed throughout the venue as he got his ass kicked by a bunch of older ladies. Reaching Ric Flair, who was still in the midst of fighting valiantly, Joeylicious bellowed his hero's famous battle cry, "Woo!" Then he launched himself into the action, thus keeping his Saturday night wrestling streak alive and well. All of the tension, frustration, and aggression flowed from Joeylicious as he refused to turn down any white-haired foe willing to face him. The brawl was in full swing, but something near the front of the gym caught Joeylicious's attention. As if in slow motion, he turned to see the last person he had expected to see that night. Standing at the entrance was Anne-Marie, a look of shock and horror on her face. Holding her hand was her 4-year-old daughter and miniature twin, Veronica, who was more awed by the spectacle than shocked. It took a moment before Anne-Marie could actually believe what her eyes were seeing, and it took another moment before she realized that her daughter was seeing the same thing. She quickly pulled Veronica close to her and shielded her eyes. Joeylicious's fists had stopped flying as he breathed her name. "Anne-Marie?" But before he could get a response from his one-time girlfriend, not that a response was coming, a frail senior snuck up behind him. With a steel folding chair in hand, the diabolical old-timer struck the Italian Dream over the head and put him to sleep. For real. The last thing Joey remembered as he fell to the floor unconscious was the memorable look on Anne-Marie's face. As impossible as it was to believe, their third reunion was even worse than their first two, combined.